Do you want to go somewhere else?
No, I just want to enable content. Yeah, just. Okay, assalamu alaikum. Okay, good afternoon. So today's lecture is about reflexes and muscle tone. So essentially what we will focus on is the lower motor neuron controls of movement. Okay. So as we know that the lower motor neurons, they have their cell bodies residing in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and they are directly in contact with the muscle cells, while the upper motor neurons are the ones that have their cell bodies either in the brain or the brainstem, and descend to synapse with the lower motor neurons. Okay, so today's topic is mainly on the lower motor neurons. Okay, so as we know that any motor behavior is mainly executed by muscles. Okay, and so we have multiple types of muscles, and the type of muscle that we're gonna talk about is the skeletal muscles. Okay, and so as you learned from previous years, that muscles work in opposing groups to do either extension or flexion, right? So like you can see here, this is the bucket knife. And so if the movement of your arm was in the way that you would be opening the knife, it would be called extension. If it was as if you are closing the knife, then it would be flexion. And so muscles, they work in opposing groups, okay? So for example, in this case here, the biceps and the triceps, they are antagonists of each other. So the tricep is the extensor, okay, muscle, while the bicep is the flexor muscle, okay? So they oppose each other movements. Whilst the biceps and the brachialis are basically work along each other as synergists, okay? So this is just to introduce, basic muscles concepts. Now we know each muscle consists of multiple fibers, as you can see here, okay? So these muscles have the ability to contract because of the innervation of the motor neurons, which basically each axon, each fiber is innervated, as you can see here. Each fiber is innervated by an axon branch of the motor neuron. And as we said, that the lower motor neurons, they have their cell bodies residing in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and they exit to synapse directly with the muscle fibers, okay? And so a single alpha motor neuron with all the branches that it makes with the fibers is what we call a motor unit, okay? So you can see here that we have one alpha motor neuron, which is making, contacting, making synapsing with, multiple fibers via different branches of the same single alpha motor neuron. So all of this is called what? Motor unit. Very good. So a single motor unit. So muscles, the contraction of the muscles require the contractions of multiple motor units. And so these motor units, so we have two types of motor neurons. We have two types of motor neurons that are innervating the muscles. The first type is the alpha motor neurons, okay? So the first type is the alpha motor neurons. These are the ones that are directly triggering the contraction of the skeletal muscle, okay? The other type is the gamma motor neurons, okay? These are basically works in a way that it will increase or decrease the sensitivity of the sensory neurons, as we will see in a second. So what we need to be concerning about at this moment is that the motor neuron that is directly contracting the muscle cell, okay, is the alpha motor neuron, okay? Now, as you can see that the alpha motor neuron is the, is basically the A alpha type, which is the biggest, okay? And so the transmit of information is very fast, whereas with the gamma, it has, smaller diameter. And so the transmit of the information is fairly slow, but they are myelinated, okay? Now, the lower motor neurons, which basically is the alpha motor neurons, just for now, the lower motor neurons, is basically represent the final pathway for the contraction of the muscle, okay? So the lower motor neurons control of the, or regulation of the skeletal muscles represent the final pathway to initiate the movement or the contraction of the muscle, okay? However, there are other levels where motor behavior is controlled, okay? There is the higher hierarchy control of motor movement, which comes from the, the brain and the brain stem. So neurons residing in there, they are responsible for planning, initiation, and direction of the voluntary skeletal, movement or muscle movement, okay? There is also another level of the control of motor behavior, okay? But this is more indirectly. Like, for example, we know the cerebellum mainly coordinates, the ongoing movements by indirectly communicating with the, with the brain, okay, with the motor cortex. And we have also the basal ganglia, which we know that what it does, it's responsible for the initiation of the proper initiation of movement and the, masking the or suppression of the unwanted movements, okay? So there are about 3 levels for the control of motor movements. Basically, the final pathway for, in order to bring an action, it has to be through the lower motor neurons, which are residing in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, okay? So what we will focus on is this level of control for this lecture, okay? So there are movements or local circuits which are mainly mediated at this level. So there is no need for an upper motor neuron, involvement in executing this motor behavior. And these are basically reflexes, okay? So which what we will focus on in this topic. Any questions so far? All good? Okay. Now, so as you can see that the alpha motor neuron can receive inputs from either 3 sources, because we said that the lower motor neurons are the final pathway for the execution of the contraction of the muscles. So they could be either receiving input from 3 sources. The first source is that it could be receiving from an input from the spinal interneurons, which are happening at the locally at the spinal cord. Okay, so this is very general. And it could be either receiving input from the sensory neurons, okay, the afferent neurons, okay, or it could be receiving input from the upper motor neurons in the brain, okay? So this is what we will be focused on, as we said, more on the circuits that are happening at the level of the spinal cord, okay? And so these lower motor neurons are fairly organized. So the ones that innervate the proximal, distal, and the distal muscles are mainly found in the cervical, thoracic region, as well as the lumbar and sacral regions of the spinal cord. The ones that innervate the axial muscles, they are found at all levels of the spinal cord, okay? Even at the level of the spinal cord, you know, their cell bodies, okay, for these alpha motor neurons, they are fairly organized. Like the alpha motor neurons that are innervating the axial muscles are found mainly medial to the ones that are innervating the proximal as well as the distal muscles, okay? So this is just to show that there is some sort of organization of the lower motor neurons. Any questions? Okay, so now let's talk about reflexes. We said that reflexes are mainly mediated by circuits that are, you know, happening at the level of the spinal cord. And these reflexes are innate, okay? So they are built-in programs, which basically are a reflex requires or, you know, occurs in response to a stimulus. So stimulus is required before a reflex, you know, take place. And so some reflexes are monosynaptic, as we will see in a second, and some are polysynaptic, requiring, you know, multiple synapses, as we will see in a second. Now, the basic steps in a basic, the steps in a basic neural reflex is that, as we said, there has to be a stimulus, okay? So the stimulus would activate the sensory receptors within the muscles. Anyone know what the sensory receptors that are in our muscles are from yesterday's lecture? Which one?
Type 1A and type 2.
Yes, very good. But what is the name of the muscle, you know, of the receptors that are found inside our muscles? All of these called something? Muscle spindles. Muscle spindles, very good. Okay, so the muscle spindles are the sensory receptors that are inside our skeletal muscles. So there is, with a reflex, it starts with a stimulus. Then basically there would be an activation of the receptor. There would be, you know, generation of a graded potential, which will depolarize the sensory neuron. Okay, so the sensory neuron will be entering the spinal cord from which side? You guys? From the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Then it will be synapsing with a motor neuron or an efferent neuron. You know, depolarizing the motor neuron would bring an action to the muscle cell to contract. Okay, so this is the basic steps of for the any neural reflex. And so, as we said, the sensory receptors which are found within our muscles are the muscle spindles. So as we learned that muscles consist of which fibers? Anyone? So how many fibers does the muscle consist of? Two types of fibers. Extrafusal fibers, very good. So we have the extrafusal fibers, okay? And we have these are the intrafusal fibers, okay, which are in the inside. Now, the muscle spindles are basically is the sensory neurons which are innervating the intrafusal fibers. So these, as what's your name? Hamza. As Hamza said, that we have the group 1A afferent neurons, which are innervating both the nuclear bag and the nuclear chain intrafusal fibers. And we have also the group 2 afferent sensory neurons, which are innervating which type of fibers?
Only the nuclear chain.
The nuclear chain fibers. Very good. So what's the difference between group 1A and group 2?
1A innervates both the nuclear bags and chains, but 2 only the nuclear.
Very good. And in terms of the functionality, what's the difference? What do they detect? Yes, very good. So with group 1A, mainly detect dynamic changes, okay? The stretch of the muscle, direction of the muscle, the speed of the change of the, of the movement of the muscle is detected by group 1A, while group 2 is mainly, constantly active to detect, to report static position of the muscle cell, okay, of the muscles, okay? Now, these are the what we call the muscle spindles, okay, the sensory neurons, innervating the extrafusal fibers in terms of the motor neurons. Anyone? Which motor neurons innervating the muscles? The alpha motor neurons innervate which part of the muscles? The extrafusal fibers. Very good. So the alpha motor neurons mainly innervate the extrafusal fibers of the muscle cells, while the gamma motor neurons innervate which type of fibers? The intrafusal fibers. Very good. So we can see that we have the gamma motor neurons here, which are innervating the intrafusal fibers of the muscle cell. Now, this is sort of what we need in order to go on to explain reflexes. Now, the first reflex that we will focus on is the stretch reflex, which, as I said, so any reflex requires a stimulus. And in this case, by tapping on the cap of the knee here, what we are initially doing is that we are stretching the muscle, okay? So by tapping, there is a stretch on there is an induced change on the length of the muscle, which will be detected by group 1A sensory neurons, okay? So these sensory neurons are gonna go to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord here, where what they will do is that they will synapse directly with an alpha motor neuron, okay? And so this alpha motor neuron here is gonna excite the extensor muscle. At the same time, as you can see here, there is also another branch from the sensory neuron, which is synapsing with an inhibitory interneuron, which will be inhibiting the alpha motor neuron that is innervating the flexor muscle. And so in this way, the leg would be extending, okay? And so by exciting the extensor and inhibiting the flexor, there would be no opposite, they wouldn't be opposing each other, resulting in the extension of the leg, okay? So basically, this starts with the stimulus that induced a change in the length of the muscle. And so the muscle spindles, they are mainly sensitive to changes in the length of the muscle. And so this we see in everybody's life, and this applies not only to the legs or the knee, it only applies to the arm, to the jaw, to the, at many other levels, okay? So in everyday life, we can see the stretch reflex, which basically is the resistance of the muscle against stretch, okay? And so, for example, here, anyone can explain? It's very similar to what happens at the level of the knee. Yeah, Hamza, come to the.
when the load increased, there was stretch at the tendon. So there was the sensory supply went through the dorsal horn to the dorsal, through the dorsal route to the dorsal horn, directly synapsing with the lower motor neuron, supplying the muscle to contract, and the interneuron will inhibit the triceps, which is the opposing muscle, so that the hand will flex and will carry the load.
Excellent, Hamza. Can you clap for Hamza? Very good. Okay, thank you, Hamza. So as Hamza explained, so basically what happens is that, as you can see, that this guy holding a cup, and so by pouring a drink, we are basically inducing a passive stretch on which muscle? Which one? Is it the biceps or the triceps that gonna be stretched? The biceps. Very good. So stretching of the biceps is the induced stretch on the bicep basically is detected by the muscle spindles, and so activate by the muscle spindles, which is going to be the group 1A sensory neurons will be carrying the signal to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and so synapsing with with two neurons, okay, directly either synapsing with an alpha motor neuron, which basically gonna excite the flexor muscle, which is in this case is the bicep, okay. At the same time, it will be synapsing with the inhibitory interneuron that will inhibit the alpha motor neuron that is innervating the tricep. And so this way, this muscle will be contracting to apply resistance against the stretch. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So we said that we have the alpha motor neuron, which is mainly responsible for the contraction of the muscle, but there is also the gamma motor neuron. So what is the gamma motor neuron for? We said the gamma motor neuron innervate which type of fibers? The intrafusal fibers. Very good. And so in basic words, the gamma motor neurons, what it does, it works as the knob that will be either highering the volume or lowering the volume on the sensitivity of the sensory muscle spindles, okay? So for example, what you can see here, so we have the muscle, the extrafusal fibers, and inside of them, we have the intrafusal fibers, right? Now, when the extrafusal fibers are contracting, as you can see here, without the activation of the gamma motor neurons, which is in this case, it's verbal, okay? So this is the alpha motor neuron, which is active. This is why we have the muscle is being contracted, okay? Now, what you can see is that the intrafusal fibers are being slack, okay, loose. And so when they are loose, there is no detection of the change happening at the level of the sensory neurons, because we said that group 1A sensory neurons, they are wrapping around which part of the muscle? Anyone? Again, group 1A sensory neurons, they are innervating which part of the muscle? The nuclear bag and the nuclear chain. Very good. And so when the intrafusal fiber is slack or loose, these sensory neurons wouldn't be able to detect the changes happening at the level of the muscle, okay? They wouldn't be knowing what's happening. And so the gamma motor neurons, activation of the gamma motor neurons is very important, because what it's gonna do is that we know that the intrafusal fibers, they have two contractile regions on the both equators, okay? And the gamma motor neurons would activate the equator of the intrafusal fibers. This will make the sensory motor neurons active to detect the changes, or to detect the changes that's happening to the muscle cell, okay, which in turn will be informing the extrafusal fibers of what is happening or what it's required to do. And so this is what's called the gamma loop. okay? Which basically means that the gamma motor neurons activation makes the intrafusal muscle fibers contract. When they are contracting, the 1A afferent sensory neurons would be active, okay? When it's active, it will be going and synapsing to the alpha motor neurons, which will be, inducing change to the extrafusal muscle fibers, okay? Is this clear? So this is what we call the gamma loop, or also called the gamma gain. And this is very important. You may wonder what really activates the gamma motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons can be activated by the upper motor neurons, okay? Or can be also influenced by local reflex circuitry. And so, as I said, that as you can see here, this is the skeletal, the extrafusal fibers, okay? And here we have the intrafusal fibers. These regions here are contractile regions of the intrafusal fibers, which are innervated by the gamma motor neurons, okay? So when they are active, when the gamma motor neurons is active, basically it will contract the intrafusal fibers. And when they are contracting, basically the sensory neurons would be active, as you can see here. So we have contraction of the of the muscle cell, the extrafusal fibers, and because of the activation of the gamma motor neurons, we have the sensitivity of the sensory neurons to detect changes are higher. Okay, or we increase the sensitivity of the sensory neurons to detect changes happening to the muscle. But if the gamma motor neurons are not active, okay, these the muscle spindles or intrafusal become a bit loose, and this means that the sensory neurons are not being active. Thus, we would not be able to, monitor the changes. The sensory neurons wouldn't be able to monitor the changes happening at the level of the extrafusal fibers. Okay, is this clear? This is very important, specifically in motor behaviors, which requires demands for or difficulty in execution of a precise movement. For example, when you are standing in a bus, for example, we know, the bus ride usually is very, so when the muscle fibers, when the gain is high, okay, and we have the gamma is activated along with the alpha motor neurons, what it means is that it will compensate for the unpredictable motor behaviors happening while you are riding a bus, okay? Or for example, while you are riding while you are walking on a rope, okay? You have to have the gamma co-activated, okay? So that the sensory neurons are active in order to be informed of what's happening to the extrafusal fibers and report these changes to the alpha motor neurons in order to adjust the length of the muscles. Okay, is this clear? Good. Okay, before we go, any questions? Okay, good. Now the second reflex is the Golgi tendon organ reflex. And as we said, that any reflex require a stimulus. And in this case, the receptor that respond or most sensitive to tension is the organ tendon organ reflex, okay? So these, unlike the muscle spindles, we said the muscle spindles are most sensitive to which type of stimulus, you guys? The stretch of the muscle. These, the Golgi tendon organ reflex, they are most responsive to the tension, okay, the force of the, of the objects. For example, when you are holding a very heavy weight, what's going to happen is that the organ the Golgi organ tendon, the Golgi tendon organ will be activated. We said that these are mainly linked to which type of sensory neurons? To the 1B. Very good, Hamza. So they are linked to the 1B sensory neurons, and so changes will be detected, and by the way, the signal would be transmitted via the 1B afferent sensory neurons. And so the sensory neuron would go to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Now it will be making two synapses, one with an inhibitory interneuron and the other one with an excitatory interneuron. Okay, so the inhibitory interneuron is gonna inhibit the alpha motor neuron that is innervating the flexor muscle. The excitatory interneuron will excite the alpha motor neuron, which is innervating the extensor muscle. And in this way, your arm would be dropping in order to protect your muscles from stretching themselves. Okay, is this clear? Good. So this is why it's this type of reflex is called a disynaptic, because unlike in the stretch reflex, where there is a direct synapse from the sensory neuron with the alpha motor neuron, whereas in this case, an interneurons are involved in mediating the action. Okay, so it is a disynaptic reflex. Now the other reflex is the flexion reflex or the withdrawal reflex, and unlike the other reflexes, in here it's mainly through the stimulation of the nociceptors. Okay, we know what a nociceptor is. Very good, which is mainly for pain, detect noxious stimuli. And so as you can see here, by tapping on a noxious stimulus, which is a nail in this case, what's going to happen is that the nociceptors become active. When they are active, they will carry the information through the A delta fibers and will go to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and will make multiple synapses. Okay, and so this is why it's called polysynaptic. Now, what's going to happen is that ipsilaterally, it will synapse with interneurons that will inhibit the extensor muscle, and it will synapse with an excitatory interneurons, which will basically activate an alpha motor neuron that innervates the flexor muscle of the affected leg. And so in this way, you will be able to move your leg away from the noxious stimulus. Okay? But if this was only what's going to happen, you will fall down, isn't it? And so what will happen as well in the same time is that interneurons, will be going, contralaterally, okay, to synapse with an excitatory, making excitatory interneuron connections as well as inhibitory interneuron connections to activate the opposite muscles on the other side, which is basically activating the extensor muscle and inhibiting the flexor muscle on the other side to make the other leg stand still in order to provide support. Okay, and so this is why it's called crossed extensor reflex, and it's a polysynaptic reflex. Okay, any questions? Okay, good. Now, so there are other reflexes which requires upper motor neurons involvement. Okay, for example, the plantar reflex, which we will not go into details about the pathways. It's a bit more complicated, but we know with the plantar reflex, there is an involvement of the upper motor neurons. Okay, so a plantar reflex is basically when you scratch the sole of the foot. In adults, this leads to flexion, okay, curling of the toes. Whereas in infants, it leads to an extension of the toes. Because in babies, the extrapyramidal tracts are not well developed, okay? And so this is called the Babinski sign, and it's very important clinically to distinguish an upper motor neuron lesion from a lower motor neuron lesion, okay? So in upper motor neuron lesions, when there is loss of the, loss of the inhibition of the upper motor neurons, okay? What's gonna happen is that instead of the plantar reflex going down, the toes will be going up, okay? And so this is called the a positive Babinski sign, okay? Up meaning an upward, upper motor neuron lesion, okay? So this is how you remember this. Now, the final part, we will talk about the muscle tone. As we learned that muscles, they have, resistance, okay, against stretch. They have an elasticity. And so a muscle tone is basically the resistance of a muscle against active or passive stretch. Passive is when somebody does it to you. Active when you do it to yourself, okay, by stretching your muscle. And so it's basically is the overall stiffness of the muscle. And muscle tone is very important clinically to distinguish again between an upper motor neuron lesion and a lower motor neuron lesion. Because of the lower motor neuron lesions, we have de-innervation of the alpha motor neurons on the muscles. Usually we have a reduced muscle tone, which is called hypotonia. Whereas in the upper motor neuron lesions, we have more of a rigid muscle tone, more spastic muscle tone, okay? There are also other signs to distinguish upper from lower motor neuron lesions. For example, a lower motor neuron lesion, there is usually a loss of, stretch reflexes, okay? Whereas in the upper motor neuron lesions, usually there is an exaggeration in the reflex because of the loss of the upper motor neuron inhibition, on the lower motor neuron lesion, in the lower motor neurons, and this is why this leads to an exaggerated, reflex, and so it's called hyperreflexia. Any questions? Okay. So the final thing, so this is an example of a an alpha motor neuron disease, okay? And this is a motor neuron disease, which basically affecting both the upper and the lower motor neurons. And a notable person with suffering from or suffered from this disease is Stephen Hawking. We all know Stephen Hawking, this good scientist. And so we all remember the ice bucket that was viral years ago. So this was for the awareness for this disease, which is the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So in these patients, there is loss or degeneration of motor neurons, which there are multiple mechanisms have been hypothesized for how the motor neurons, degenerate. One of them is that there is, impaired glutamate uptake at the astrocyte level, leading to an increase in the glutamate around the neuron, which will be causing glutamate excitotoxicity, leading to the death of the motor neuron. There are also other mechanisms. For example, there is an increased oxidative stress leading to the death of the muscle via dysfunction of the mitochondria, okay? There is, dysfunction with the neurofilament, dysfunction of the axonal transport, the pump dysfunction, overactivation of the microglia. So there are multiple proposed hypotheses, and still there is no treatment, unfortunately. It's very devastating disease, okay? So I think this is the end. Any questions?
Okay.
Yes.
What stimulates the Golgi tendon?
It's the tension on the muscle. Okay, so it's not the stretch of the muscle, the tension.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not explaining again why like the upper motor
Yeah, so with the upper motor neuron lesions, there is some, so the upper, we usually say that there is no involvement of the upper motor neurons on regulating local circuits. But there are some involvements, okay, which mainly is to inhibit unwanted movement, okay? But when there is this inhibition of the unwanted movement is lost in upper motor neuron lesion, in upper motor neuron lesions, this leads to an exaggerated reflexes. And this is why it's called hyperreflexia, and it's a sign for an upper motor neuron lesion. Whereas in the lower motor neuron lesions, there is loss of the reflexes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening. Okay. So I found another question.
Yes, Doctor, can you repeat the gamma loop?
So the gamma loop. So we said that the gamma motor neurons basically innervate the intrafusal fibers. Okay, while the alpha motor neurons, they innervate the extrafusal fibers, right? So it's so it's in here. Okay, so the gamma motor neurons, let's see. Okay, so the gamma motor neuron, the alpha motor neurons mainly innervate the extrafusal fibers, whereas the gamma motor neurons, they will be innervating the intrafusal fibers, okay? So these intrafusal fibers are innervated by the group 1A afferent neurons as well as the group 2 afferent neurons. So this is what we call the muscle spindles, which are basically the sensory receptors that will detect change on the stretch of the muscle.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Doctor.
So basically, when the extrafusal fibers are contracted, as in this example, so this is the extrafusal fibers are being contracted. Now this will make the intrafusal fibers slack, okay? So they are not really, contracted, as you can see, they are loose. And when they are loosened, the sensory neurons would not be able to detect changes happening to the extrafusal fibers, okay? However, when the gamma motor neurons are active, because they innervate the interfusal fibers, remember? So they will contract the equators of the intrafusal fibers, which are these regions. And so when these regions are, shortened, contracted, this will make the sensory neurons active. And so when they are active, they will go and synapse with the alpha motor neuron, okay, to bring an action on the extrafusal muscle fibers. So it's like a loop. There is a gamma activation. This would lead to the contraction of the intrafusal muscle fiber. This will make the sensory neurons more active, which again will go to the dorsal horn, synapsing into the alpha motor neuron to bring an action on the extrafusal muscle fibers. So this will make the muscle basically more sensitive in terms of, this will make the sensory neurons more alert of what's happening to the extrafusal fibers in order to compensate for the changes happening to the extrafusal fibers. Okay, I hope this is clear.
Doctor, can you explain slide 16?
16. So it's this slide again. So I just explained the gamma loop. So this is just showing the same thing and basically highlighting that gamma co-activation with the alpha motor neurons would make the would make the muscles more alert, or the gamma co-activation would make the sensory neurons active. So when sensory neurons are active, they will be detecting changes happening to the stretch of the muscle. And so in this way, they will inform the alpha motor neurons in order to, adjust for the contraction of the extrafusal fibers. And this is seen mainly in motor behaviors where there is, precise execution of the motor behavior is required. Like, for example, when you are riding a bus, your gamma, is going to be super active motor neurons, because there is a need for the compensation for the unpredictable changes that's going to happen to the muscles while you are riding the bus, or while you are riding walking on a road. Okay, so this is called the gamma gain. Okay, questions?
In Golgi tendon reflex, are there two interneurons?
Yes, so in Golgi tendon reflex, the sensory neuron is going to synapse with interneurons, one that is going to be inhibitory and the other one is going to be excitatory. And so both cases is going to be via interneurons, and so this is why it's called diasynaptic, okay? Because there is an involvement of the interneurons.
So we always need the gamma neurons to be active so that we can have proprioception?
There is the gamma co-activation, not all in all scenarios is required. And again, I said that the gamma activation is mainly, done by the upper motor neurons. Okay, and so in scenarios where in some scenarios there is a need for co-activation of the gamma motor neurons, and in other scenarios there is not much need for the gamma co-activation. And I've listed some scenarios in the notes if you can read them. Okay.
Someone was talking about the withdrawal reflex. Is it gonna do the opposite on the contralateral side?
Yes, so it will do the opposite on the contralateral side. So as you can see, the affected leg, it's the extensor muscle that is being inhibited. However, the extensor muscle on the other leg is activated, okay? In the affected leg, the flexor muscle is excited, while in the other leg, the flexor muscle is inhibited. And so this is why it's called crossed extensor reflex.
I think that's it.
That's it. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you.
Oh, doctor, is the stretch reflex also disynaptic?
No, the stretch reflex is considered monosynaptic, okay? Because there is a direct, I know there is here an inhibitory interneuron, but you can see that there is a direct synapse between the sensory neuron with the alpha motor neuron that will excite the extensor muscle in this case, leading to the knee jerk. So in this case it's considered monosynaptic. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks. So that's it. Okay, thank you.